Ivan Lester McGuire. On April 2nd, 1988, Ivan Lester McGuire, a 35-year-old experienced skydiver and cameraman, boarded a small aircraft at Franklin County Airport in North Carolina. McGuire was well known in the local skydiving community. He had logged hundreds of jumps and often filmed students as they made their first dives. That afternoon, his goal was to capture a training skydive from a unique perspective. McGuire climbed aboard with his camera gear strapped to his helmet and chest, but in his focus on setting up the camera, he forgot one essential item: his parachute. Incredibly, no one in the plane noticed as he geared up. He carried his camera case, oxygen mask, and heavy equipment, but left behind the rig that was supposed to save his life. When the plane reached altitude, McGuire jumped alongside two students and their instructor. His camera rolled as they performed maneuvers. Everything seemed normal until the group deployed their parachutes and began gliding safely toward the ground. McGuire kept falling. His final footage is chilling. He continues to film, breathing heavily, his camera pointed upward at the others drifting under canopy. Then the ground rushes closer. His last words, muffled on tape, were panicked gasps as he realized too late what he had forgotten. Seconds later, he hit the ground at over 120 miles per hour. The impact killed him instantly. Investigators later confirmed what the tape revealed. He had jumped without a parachute. His death was not caused by a malfunction, bad weather, or an accident, but by forgetting the single most essential piece of equipment. To many in the sport, it remains one of the most senseless and avoidable fatalities in skydiving history. Jan Davis. On October 23, 1999, 60-year-old Jan Davis, a respected photographer and base jumper, climbed to the top of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. The event was meant as a protest. Base jumpers were lobbying to legalize the sport in the park. To make their case, Davis and others planned demonstration jumps in front of reporters and cameras. There was one problem. Davis didn't own her own base-specific parachute rig. She borrowed one from another jumper. She had never tested it, never trained with it, and didn't know the gear's quirks. For a sport as unforgiving as base jumping, this was a deadly oversight. When her turn came, Davis stepped to the edge. In front of a crowd of onlookers, she leapt from El Capitan's 3,200-foot face. At first, her fall was smooth, but when she pulled her pilot chute, her main canopy failed to inflate properly. The lines twisted. The borrowed rig did not respond the way she expected. Struggling desperately, she had only seconds. Her chute partially opened but spun uncontrollably, giving her no chance to slow down. Witnesses watched in horror as she smashed into the talus below. The death was not quick. Reports said Davis survived the initial impact with multiple broken bones, but died shortly after from massive internal injuries. The irony was crushing. She had jumped to show that base jumping could be safe, but using borrowed equipment without practice turned it into a public tragedy. David Crouch. On July 17, 1987, David Crouch, a 29-year-old skydiver in Texas, decided to celebrate before his jump. He had been drinking heavily throughout the day, ignoring warnings from friends and instructors. By the time he boarded the small aircraft with his parachute, his blood alcohol level was more than double the legal driving limit. At altitude, Crouch lined up at the door, visibly unsteady. Witnesses later said his speech was slurred and his coordination off, but he insisted on going through with the jump. When the plane reached 10,000 feet, he stumbled out into the open air. At first, the free fall seemed stable, but when it came time to deploy his parachute, his intoxicated state became obvious. He pulled late, far below safe altitude. His main chute tangled, opening partially but collapsing almost immediately. In his confusion, he never managed to pull his reserve. Crouch plummeted into a field at over 100 miles per hour. The crash shattered nearly every bone in his body. He survived the initial impact for several minutes, screaming in agony before bleeding out from internal injuries. Investigators ruled his death the result of gross negligence. Alcohol and skydiving had combined into a fatal mistake. His case became one of the clearest reminders that judgment is as critical as equipment. Owen Hart. On May 23, 1999, professional wrestler Owen Hart died in an accident that blurred the line between skydiving, stunts, and aerial rigging. At WWF's Over the Edge event in Kansas City, Hart was scheduled to make a dramatic entrance, descending from the rafters on a harness as part of his Blue Blazer character. The stunt was designed to look like a superhero skydiving into the ring. But the rigging team made a critical error. They used a quick-release clip better suited for sailing equipment than for suspending a human being. The clip required only slight pressure to open. As Hart was lowered from the rafters, 80 feet above the ring, the clip disengaged. In front of 16,000 fans, he fell straight to the mat. Unlike skydivers, he had no parachute, no backup system, no chance to react. The fall broke his ribs and sternum, tore his aorta, and caused massive internal bleeding. Witnesses said he was still alive for several minutes after hitting the ring, groaning in pain as medical staff rushed to him. He died soon afterward. Though not a traditional skydive, Hart's death is often grouped with aerial descent accidents. It showed how one careless equipment choice, a clip designed for convenience, not safety, could turn a stunt into a catastrophe. George Griffin and Brianna Laux. On July 7, 2012, 41-year-old instructor George Griffin and his 25-year-old student, Brianna Laux, prepared for a tandem jump in Chester, South Carolina. Tandem jumps are supposed to be the safest form of skydiving, with the instructor responsible for all equipment. But on that day, a fatal oversight doomed them both. As the plane climbed to altitude, Griffin realized he had forgotten to connect the reserve parachute's harness correctly. The reserve was technically packed and present, but its straps were not attached to the tandem harness. This meant that if the main failed, the backup would do nothing. At 13,500 feet, they leapt together. In freefall, everything seemed fine, but when Griffin pulled the main, it failed to deploy correctly. He cut it away and reached for the reserve. The reserve canopy fired, but it was not attached to them. It floated away into the sky as Griffin and Laux continued falling. Realizing the mistake, Griffin tried to hold Brianna tighter, but there was nothing more he could do. They slammed into the ground at terminal velocity, both dying instantly from blunt force trauma. For investigators, the mistake was shocking in its simplicity. One missed step in pre-flight checks had killed 2 people. For the student who trusted her instructor completely, it was an especially cruel fate. Roger Nelson. Roger Nelson was no novice. He was a legend in skydiving, founder of Skydive Chicago, and had logged more than 6,000 jumps. But on June 7, 2003, he made the kind of mistake usually reserved for beginners, one that cost him his life. That afternoon, Nelson participated in a routine skydive with friends. At altitude, he deployed his parachute normally and descended under canopy. But as he approached the landing zone, he attempted a dangerous maneuver called a hook turn, a sharp diving turn near the ground that builds speed for a flashy landing. Hook turns can look spectacular, but they are notorious for causing fatal crashes. The risk is that the parachute does not have enough altitude to recover before the ground arrives. Nelson executed his turn too low. His canopy dived steeply, and before it could level out, he slammed into the ground at high speed. The impact shattered his legs and pelvis. Witnesses rushed to him, finding him conscious but screaming in agony. He survived for several hours before dying in the hospital from massive internal injuries. For the skydiving community, Nelson's death was especially painful. A man who had built his life around safety and training had been undone by a moment of showboating. His crash became a grim warning that experience offers no immunity when basic rules are ignored.